I didn't expect a 5-minute conversation in a hospital waiting room to change how I see myself, but it did. And the strange part is, nothing dramatic even happened. I used to believe I was a good judge of people. That was something I felt quietly proud of. I worked in a mid-sized marketing firm in Chicago, nothing glamorous, just open desks, fluorescent lighting, and the steady hum of keyboards. My job was analyzing customer behavior, studying patterns, predicting decisions, figuring out why people clicked or didn't click. Psychology fascinated me. Human behavior felt like a puzzle I was good at solving. Outside of work, I carried that same confidence into everyday life. I'd meet someone and within minutes feel like I understood them. The way they spoke, the way they paused, the tone behind their words. I'd make quiet conclusions. Reliable, insecure, arrogant, kind. I never said those things out loud, but I labeled people internally. It made the world feel organized. I remember thinking once, most people are pretty easy to read. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, my perspective started to shift. It began with my coworker, Daniel. Daniel had joined our team about 3 months earlier. He was quiet, almost painfully so. He avoided eye contact in meetings. When he spoke, he rushed to sentences like he was apologizing for taking up time. To me, he seemed insecure, maybe socially anxious, possibly not confident enough for the job. I didn't dislike him, I just categorized him. In team discussions, he rarely pushed back. When our manager criticized the campaign draft he had worked on, Daniel simply nodded and said, "That makes sense," even when the criticism didn't seem fair. I remember thinking, if he doesn't stand up for himself, people will keep walking over him. One afternoon, we were assigned to collaborate on a client presentation. It was a tight deadline, and tension in the office was already high. We booked a small conference room. I laid out my ideas confidently, speaking quickly, organizing slides, suggesting changes. Daniel listened quietly, occasionally saying, "Yeah, that works." At one point, I asked, "Do you agree with this angle or do you see it differently?" He paused. For a second, I thought he didn't have an opinion. Then he said softly, "I think the client's hesitation isn't about budget. It's about trust. They've been burned before." I blinked. That hadn't occurred to me. He continued, still calm. "If we focus on transparency instead of price, I think they'll respond better." It was a good point. Actually, it was more than good. It shifted the entire strategy. But what struck me wasn't just his insight. It was how quietly certain he sounded. Not defensive, not loud, just steady. That was the first small crack in my assumption. Still, I brushed it aside. One good insight didn't change my mental category of him. Then, something else happened. A week later, Daniel didn't show up to work. We received a brief email from HR saying he'd be out for a few days due to a family emergency. No details. Office speculation started immediately. Maybe someone's sick. Maybe it's not serious. I didn't think much about it at first. People have things going on. Life happens. 3 days later, I found myself in a hospital waiting room after work. My sister had injured her ankle and I drove her to get it checked out. It wasn't serious, but we were stuck there longer than expected. Hospitals have a strange energy. Time feels slower. Conversations are softer. Everyone looks slightly more fragile. As I sat there scrolling through my phone, I noticed someone familiar across the room. Daniel. He was sitting alone, leaning forward, elbows on his knees, staring at the floor. He looked different. Not weak, not anxious, just exhausted. I hesitated before walking over. Part of me didn't want to intrude, but another part felt like I should acknowledge him. "Hey," I said gently. He looked up, surprised. Then he gave a small nod. "Oh, hey." I sat down beside him. There was an awkward pause. "Everything okay?" I asked. He exhaled slowly. "My dad had a stroke." The words landed heavier than I expected. "I'm sorry," I said. It felt inadequate. He nodded. Yeah, it was sudden. There was silence again, but it didn't feel empty. After a moment, he added, "He's stable, but recovery is going to be long." I didn't know what to say. I wasn't used to seeing him this way, open, direct, without the rushed speech from the office. Then he said something that stayed with me. "I'm the only one nearby," he explained. "My sister's overseas, so I've been handling everything." There was no complaint in his voice, just fact. Suddenly, pieces began rearranging in my mind. The quietness at work, the calm responses, the lack of defensiveness. I had labeled those traits as insecurity, but what if they weren't? I asked carefully, "How long have you been dealing with this?" He gave a small smile. "He's had health issues for years. I moved back to the city mainly to help out." Moved back. I hadn't known that. At work, I had assumed he was just new, finding his feeding, trying to fit in. But here he was, someone balancing hospital visits, responsibility, probably stress I couldn't see, and still showing up every day without drama. That was the turning point for me. Not because of what he said, but because of what I realized. I had been observing behavior without understanding context, and context changes everything.
In psychology, we talk about attribution, how we explain people's actions. I had learned about it in college, the fundamental attribution error, the tendency to attribute someone's behavior to their personality rather than their circumstances. I had studied that concept, but I hadn't noticed I was living it. I thought Daniel avoided confrontation because he lacked confidence. Maybe he avoided unnecessary conflict because he didn't have the emotional bandwidth for it. I thought he rushed his speech because he was unsure. Maybe he was simply efficient, conserving energy for more important battles. I thought he was passive. Maybe he was prioritizing peace. The realization wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, but it unsettled me. If I was wrong about him, how many other people had I misread? Over the next few weeks, I started paying closer attention, not to analyze, but to observe without labeling. When someone cut me off in traffic, I noticed the immediate thought, they're careless. Then I caught myself. Or maybe they're rushing to something urgent. When a colleague seemed short in an email, instead of assuming irritation, I considered overload. It felt strange at first. My brain wanted to categorize. It was efficient. Quick judgments save time. But they also erase complexity. Daniel returned to work the following Monday. He looked tired but composed. In a team meeting, our manager challenged one of his slides again. This time, Daniel didn't immediately agree. He calmly explains his reasoning. Not aggressively, just clearly. I watched differently now. There was strength in him I hadn't noticed before. Not loud strength, not dominating presence, but resilience. And something else shifted inside me. I realized I had built part of my identity around being perceptive, around understanding people quickly. But maybe true perception isn't about speed. Maybe it's about patience, about holding space for the possibility that you don't know the full story. That idea stayed with me longer than I expected. A few days later, Daniel and I grabbed coffee after work to finalize some presentation details. Conversation drifted beyond work for the first time. He asked about my family. I found myself opening up too about my sister, about growing up in a household where conflict was loud and constant. I admitted something I hadn't consciously linked before. "I think I'm uncomfortable with silence," I told him. "I always assume it means something's wrong." He nodded thoughtfully. "For me," he said, "silence is usually where things make sense." That sentence hit me harder than it should have. Two different interpretations of the same behavior. Silence. For me, tension. For him, clarity. Same external action, different internal meaning. That's when the deeper lesson settled in.
Most of what we judge isn't the behavior itself, it's our projection onto it, our past, our fears, our expectations. I had been seeing people through a lens shaped by my own experiences, not theirs. And without realizing it, I had been shrinking them into simplified versions that made me comfortable. There's something unsettling about recognizing your own blind spots. It's easier to believe you're objective. It's harder to accept that you're interpreting everything through invisible filters. Over time, my interactions changed in small ways. I asked more questions instead of assuming answers. I paused before reacting. I listened longer. Not because I was trying to be virtuous, but because I genuinely didn't trust my first interpretation anymore. And that felt oddly freeing. I didn't have to be the guy who figured people out instantly. I could just be someone curious. One evening, months later, Daniel's father was recovering steadily. We were wrapping up another project when he turned to me and said, "Thanks for checking in back then. It meant more than you probably realized." I almost told him that he had no idea how much that brief hospital conversation had shifted something in me. But I didn't, because the truth is, he never set out to teach me anything. He was just living his life. And that's what makes it powerful. The biggest perspective shifts don't come from grand speeches or dramatic events. They come from ordinary moments that quietly expose our assumptions. I still analyze human behavior, it's part of my job, but I approach it differently now. I've learned that quick conclusions feel intelligent, but slow understanding is wiser. And sometimes I think back to that hospital waiting room. Two people sitting under harsh fluorescent lights, both carrying things the other couldn't see. It makes me wonder how many invisible stories are walking past us every day. How many people we reduce to traits because it's easier than imagining their complexity. That small encounter changed how I see others. But more importantly, it changed how I see myself. Not as someone who understands people quickly, but as someone who is still learning how little I actually know. And maybe that's the real shift. Maybe growth isn't about becoming better at reading people. Maybe it's about becoming humbler in the presence of what you can't see. Because every person you meet is fighting a battle you didn't witness. And every judgment you make says as much about you as it does about them. So now, when I catch myself labeling someone too quickly, I pause and ask, what story am I missing? And more importantly, what story might they be carrying that I'll never fully understand?